The pages of your high school history textbook told you about Gettysburg, Pearl Harbor, and D-Day. But what if I told you that some of the most pivotal, brutal, and game-changing battles in American history were deliberately erased from those same pages? What if the conflicts that truly shaped this nation, the ones that reveal uncomfortable truths about power, conquest, and resistance, have been systematically buried beneath sanitized narratives, designed to make us feel better about our past? Today we're diving deep into the forgotten battlefields that textbook publishers don't want you to know about. These aren't just minor skirmishes or footnotes in military history. These are massive conflicts, decisive victories, and devastating defeats that changed the course of American development forever. Yet they've been scrubbed from classroom discussions, reduced to highway markers that most people drive past without a second glance, or twisted into sanitized stories that bear little resemblance to the brutal realities of what actually happened. By the end of this series, you'll understand how the battle for historical truth is still being fought in school districts across America. You'll discover why certain stories get buried while others get amplified, and you'll learn about conflicts so significant that their erasure from education represents nothing less than the theft of our collective memory. But first, let me show you just how systematic this historical cover-up really is. The pattern starts to emerge when you realize that American textbooks have been shaped not by historians seeking truth, but by politicians, publishers, and special interest groups seeking control over the narrative. The power to decide which battles make it into classrooms has been weaponized for over a century, creating generations of Americans who know almost nothing about the true scope of violence that built this nation. We're talking about conflicts where thousands died, where entire communities were wiped off the map, and where the outcomes determined who would control vast territories and resources for generations to come. Consider this shocking reality. Since 1775, the United States has fought more than 100 wars. 100. Yet the average American can name maybe 5 or 6 of them. The rest have been systematically erased, buried in archives, or reduced to single sentences in textbooks that spend more time discussing the Boston Tea Party than they do explaining centuries of continental conquest. This isn't accidental. This is deliberate historical engineering designed to maintain comfortable myths about American exceptionalism while hiding the brutal mechanics of how this empire was actually built. The erasure begins with something historians call the lost cause narrative, a deliberate rewriting of history that started in the South after the Civil War but eventually infected textbooks nationwide. By the 1932, publishers had sanitized American history to such an extent that even northern schools were teaching romanticized versions of slavery, conquest, and expansion that bore little resemblance to documented historical facts. Textbook review panels began demanding changes that would make certain stories disappear entirely, threatening to cancel massive book contracts unless publishers removed uncomfortable truths about violence, genocide, and oppression. But here's where it gets really insidious. The battles that have been erased aren't random omissions. They follow a clear pattern. Conflicts where Native Americans achieved stunning military victories over American forces get buried. Labor wars where American workers fought pitched battles against corporate armies and federal troops disappear from curricula. Naval conflicts that established crucial precedents for American foreign policy get reduced to footnotes. Any battle that reveals the calculated, often brutal nature of American expansion gets sanitized beyond recognition or eliminated entirely. Take the Quasi-War with France, an undeclared naval conflict from 1798 to 1800 that most Americans have never heard of, despite its massive impact on the development of American naval doctrine and foreign policy. This wasn't some minor diplomatic disagreement. This was a shooting war fought across the Atlantic Ocean and Caribbean, involving dozens of naval battles, captured ships, and strategic decisions that shaped how America would project power for the next 2 centuries. French privateers were seizing American merchant vessels. American naval forces were engaging in running battles with French warships, and the outcomes established precedents that guided American maritime strategy through both world wars. Yet this conflict, which proved that the young American Republic could hold its own against a European naval power, receives maybe a paragraph in most textbooks. Why? Because it complicates clean narratives about American isolationism and reveals that from its earliest days, this nation was willing to fight undeclared wars to protect its economic interests. The Quasi-War doesn't fit the story that textbook publishers want to tell about peaceful American development, so it gets buried beneath discussions of domestic politics and westward expansion. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when you examine how the American Indian Wars have been systematically erased from classroom instruction. We're talking about more than 250 years of continuous warfare, involving hundreds of distinct battles, campaigns, and massacres that determined who would control the North American continent. By 1800, approximately 600,000 Native Americans lived in what would become the contiguous United States. By 1890, their population had declined to about 250,000. This represents one of the most successful campaigns of territorial conquest in human history, achieved through coordinated military action, biological warfare, and systematic destruction of indigenous food sources and cultural institutions. Yet high school students learn almost nothing about the specific battles, strategies, and outcomes that made this conquest possible. The Battle of Fallen Timbers, which opened the Ohio Territory to American settlement, gets maybe a sentence or two despite being one of the most consequential military engagements in American history. General Arthur Street, Clair's devastating defeat by Native American forces, the worst military disaster in American history until Pearl Harbor, disappears entirely from most curricula because it reveals that indigenous peoples were capable of sophisticated military organization and devastating tactical victories against American forces. This systematic erasure serves a clear purpose. It maintains the myth that American expansion was inevitable and relatively peaceful, driven by hardy pioneers and manifest destiny, rather than coordinated military campaigns designed to eliminate indigenous resistance and seize territory through organized violence. Students learn about covered wagons and homesteads, but not about the military logistics that made westward expansion possible. They hear about brave settlers, but not about the systematic destruction of Native American food sources, the deliberate spread of diseases, or the coordinated campaigns to eliminate indigenous military capability. The Civil War provides perhaps the most striking example of how even well-documented conflicts can be sanitized through selective emphasis and deliberate omission. Most Americans know about Gettysburg and Antietam, but they know almost nothing about the thousands of smaller engagements that reveal the personal, chaotic, and often contradictory nature of America's bloodiest conflict. Foraging parties that turned into pitched battles, raids that destroyed entire communities, and strategic victories that enabled prolonged resistance get buried beneath discussions of grand strategy and famous generals. The Battle of Palmito Hill, fought in May 1865, after the main Confederate surrenders, challenges clean narratives about the war's end and reveals how Confederate resistance continued long after textbooks claim the conflict was over. The burning of the Norfolk Naval Yard, which provided the Confederacy with massive military resources without a single shot being fired, demonstrates how strategic incompetence and political maneuvering often determined outcomes more than battlefield heroics. These forgotten engagements reveal that the Civil War was messier, more personal, and far more brutal than sanitized textbook accounts suggest. But the most systematic erasure involves conflicts that occurred within American borders between different classes and racial groups. The Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921 was the largest labor uprising in American history, involving over 10,000 coal miners in armed conflict against mine guards and federal troops. This wasn't a protest or a strike. This was a shooting war fought on American soil, complete with aerial reconnaissance, machine gun emplacements, and coordinated military tactics. Yet most Americans have never heard of it, because it reveals uncomfortable truths about class warfare and state violence against American workers. The Ludlow Massacre of 1914 represents another deliberate erasure that reveals the true extent of domestic warfare in American history. When coal miners in Colorado went on strike for basic safety protections and union recognition, the Colorado National Guard responded by opening fire on a tent colony housing striking workers and their families. They used machine guns. They set fire to tents with families still inside. They killed women and children in what can only be described as a military assault on American civilians. Yet this battle, which involved coordinated military tactics and resulted in dozens of casualties, gets reduced to a brief mention of labor unrest in most textbooks. Why does this matter? Because these erasures aren't just about the past. They're about controlling how Americans understand the present. When students learn sanitized versions of American expansion, they're being programmed to accept contemporary military interventions as natural and inevitable. When they don't learn about domestic conflicts between classes and races, they can't recognize similar patterns playing out today. The battle for textbook content is really a battle for the American mind, and the side that controls the narrative controls how future generations will interpret everything, from foreign policy to economic inequality. The mechanics of this censorship reveal just how deliberate the process has become. Textbook adoption policies in states like Texas and California give enormous power to review panels that can demand specific changes or threaten to cancel multi-million-dollar contracts. Publishers have learned to anticipate these demands, creating content that avoids controversial topics entirely rather than risk losing access to massive markets. The result is a feedback loop where textbooks become increasingly sanitized with each edition, gradually erasing more and more uncomfortable truths about American history. But here's what makes this particularly insidious. The battles being erased aren't just random military engagements. They're specifically the conflicts that reveal how American power actually works. Naval battles that established precedents for projecting force abroad get buried. Indigenous victories that demonstrate sophisticated military resistance disappear. Labor wars that show state violence against American workers vanish. Any engagement that complicates the narrative of peaceful, inevitable American progress gets systematically eliminated from classroom instruction. The Northwest Indian Wars provide a perfect case study in how this erasure operates. Between 1785 and 1795, a sophisticated confederacy of Native American tribes inflicted devastating defeats on American forces, including General Josiah Harmar's expedition and Arthur Street Clair's catastrophic loss of nearly his entire army. These weren't minor skirmishes. These were coordinated military campaigns involving thousands of warriors using advanced tactics to outmaneuver and destroy American forces in battles that claimed hundreds of lives and altered the entire strategic situation in the Ohio Territory. Yet students learn almost nothing about the military genius of leaders like Little Turtle, Blue Jacket, and Bukongahelas, who created one of the most effective military alliances in North American history. They don't learn about the sophisticated logistics that allowed Native American forces to sustain long-term campaigns across vast territories. They don't learn about the tactical innovations that allowed smaller indigenous forces to repeatedly defeat larger, better-equipped American armies. Instead, they get vague references to Indian troubles that were eventually resolved through negotiations and treaties. This systematic minimization serves a clear purpose. It maintains the myth that American expansion was opposed only by scattered, disorganized tribes, rather than sophisticated military coalitions capable of strategic planning and devastating tactical execution. It erases evidence that indigenous peoples had legitimate claims to territory and the military capability to defend those claims. Most importantly, it obscures the calculated nature of the military campaigns that eventually broke Native American resistance through systematic destruction of food sources, deliberate targeting of non-combatants, and coordinated efforts to eliminate indigenous military leadership. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when you examine how these erasures compound over generations. Students who learn sanitized versions of American expansion in high school become teachers, journalists, and politicians who perpetuate those same sanitized narratives. They write textbooks that eliminate even more uncomfortable truths. They create educational standards that avoid controversial topics entirely. They participate in textbook adoption processes that reward publishers for producing content that feels comfortable, rather than content that reflects documented historical reality. Consider how this affects our understanding of contemporary conflicts. When Americans don't learn about the Quasi-War with France, they can't recognize similar patterns in modern undeclared conflicts. When they don't learn about the systematic nature of campaigns against Native Americans, they can't identify comparable strategies in contemporary military interventions. When they don't learn about domestic conflicts between classes and races, they interpret current social conflicts as unprecedented rather than as continuations of long-standing patterns of organized violence. The erasure of labor warfare provides particularly striking examples of how textbook censorship shapes contemporary political consciousness.